India cannot decide which soft power to spread across the world, which soft power will not backfire and such things, unless it has some idea of what Indology has given to the country. And then you have issues such as California textbooks, where for the first time this small group of Indians has succeeded significantly and is at least forcing the writers of school textbooks to say that there was a view of history that I summarized earlier, but now alternative theories are also being mentioned. Those parts of the Rig Veda which describe the Saraswati river as flowing could not be later than 1900 BC. That typical Indian civilization that is reflected in the Mahabharata could not be later than 3000 BC. Indology will occasionally go wrong. Indology will not have all the proper means to gather evidence. Indologists will make mistakes. But if we ignore their findings, the price will not be only India's to pay. The price will be the world to pay. Now, the field about which I am going to talk is generally referred to as Indology, and right now one can legitimately say it's a politicized field also, with the notion of soft power that has entered in international relations. This has become even more important because India cannot decide which soft power to spread across the world, which soft power will not backfire and such things, unless it has some idea of what Indology has given to the country. So it's very important stepping stones toward all these things. Idea of Indology will come later, and what kind of work you can do and other things will gradually follow. Let me first of all try to explain to you why Indology is important. All such subjects are interdependent, so some of the things will require revisiting even in the few minutes we have. But let's start with what I consider to be incontestable things. First of all, India has a unique civilization that is very ancient. This is undeniable. How ancient can be a matter of controversy, but it is a very old civilization, and it is distinct especially from the civilization or culture that is dominating the world right now. It's very different in fundamentals. Secondly, it's one of the few, perhaps the only ancient civilization that is continuous in its moorings, in its specific teachings to the world, in its storehouse of experience and so on. Yeah, Egyptian civilization was ancient, it has disappeared. Greek civilization has given a lot to the world, but there is hardly anything typically Greek that is found now. Whatever is found is through the influence of modern developed situations, the French civilization, the English civilization, and so on. In the case of China, we do have an ancient civilization, but with the entrance of Marxism and other kind of thinking, the old Chinese civilization is much more suppressed, much more difficult to recognize than anything in India. So we have a continuous civilization that has suffered setbacks, that has undergone very significant changes, but that has not really been suppressed, that has not really been so suppressed as to be unrecognizable. And there is also a history in India of this civilization suffering setbacks but again reasserting itself. So even in the reassertion effort, it has a lot of experience of the past. And that's why it is in one sense strong, better prepared. In the Chinese civilization, you have now more than 1 billion people who are not at all sure what to assert of their old civilization in the modern world. People, the Chinese government for a long time, for example, could not decide whether it should go for Buddhism or it should go for Confucianism. And Confucianism started about 15 years ago to reassert itself in China. Confucianism and Buddhism essentially pose the same problem for the makers of modern Chinese civilization, because in both there is really no recognition of a supreme God, there is no recognition of an exclusive understanding to a particular religious mode of worship or whatever we normally associate with religion. Being atheistic in their main thrust, these two presented a similar challenge to China. And they thought that Confucianism being native, Confucianism not having any relationship with any other country in the world, which has been claimed and which can legitimately be claimed as Chinese contribution, was much better. And that's why 15-20 years ago, slowly the present rulers of Canada began to establish Confucian institutes outside. The results are very mixed. That is, universities like my university were approached and said, could you establish this kind of for teaching Chinese language, for teaching Chinese literature and so on. And some universities in North America especially, the colleges accepted, but the universities did not accept that much. And they thought, well, some experts in teaching Chinese are being given to us free of cost. Our students need to learn Chinese. What loss is there in accepting these institutes in our premises? And that's how it started. Still, they have not picked up very much. And the reason probably is that the promoters of this institute, as well as the recipients of this institute, do not believe in each other that much. There is no atmosphere of trust. There is something coming from a totalitarian government is viewed suspiciously in most free countries. And if this whole thing stops at teaching the language, it would be in one way better. But with the language, a new philosophy and a political ideology is also introduced in these institutes. And North Americans, for right or wrong reasons, are extremely suspicious of these things. Even the ordinary, primary introductory language texts have a coloring of Marxism, have a coloring of political realities, politically favored doctrines in them. And Western countries are apprehensive about it. Buddhism, you might have noticed in the last 2 weeks, the change has occurred. That is, for the first time, a Chinese official said, Buddhism is not an Indian religion. It's our religion. It started here. So this is a typical stage again in totalitarian countries. That is, you assert historical truth, assert something as historical truth without worrying about whether it's borne out by facts, by pieces of evidence or not. And why this sudden love of Buddhism? Buddhism is an atheistic religion, that's why it should be preferred. to Islam, to the theistic forms of Hinduism. That's understandable. But it has been realized that nationalism also has to be there. That is, communism has nowhere in the world replaced nationalism. For the first few years of the communist revolution, yes, you have a talk of masses rising, not believing any particular sacred scripture, not believing any particular class that promotes its ideology and so on. And within 50 to 100 years, it begins to change. It seems to fall short in meeting the expectations of ordinary citizens. And it's thought that there's a vacuum is left. Even if you say there should be equitable distribution of wealth, even if you actually implement that change to a considerable extent, there is something that people do not receive. And that then they begin to explore other alternatives. In Soviet Union, for example, the churches had to be opened again. Right now, there is considerable religious freedom in Russia, the biggest remnant of the erstwhile Soviet Union. So, in both these countries, which were the most prominent examples of the adoption of communist or Marxist ideology, yes, people gained a lot. Yes, the countries became very strong. The world had to pay respect to them. The world had to listen to what they were doing. In that sense, there was progress. Certain diseases went out of existence. Certain things, malnourishment, hunger, those were removed. But still, there was some kind of dissatisfaction that even people and theoreticians of this new political state could not articulate. Some kind of dissatisfaction was spreading. So, accept something that is recognized in the West as religion, whether its originators called it a religion or not, that's Buddhism. And so you have a pronouncement that Buddhism is a Chinese religion, and you do not really go against the state, you do not do anything anti-national. If you say I'm a Buddhist or I visit a Buddhist monastery or something like that. Very small part of it could be the appeasement of the Tibetan people. That's possible, but China can suppress Tibet any time in the present situation. So that could not have been the major reason. There is some deeper reason that a large section of the population feels dissatisfied, is restless, and that has to be addressed. That must be the thing. And one of the most surprising announcements in this development in the last 2 weeks or so is suddenly an announcement is made, Buddha's relics have been discovered at some place. If you look at the announcement closely, there is no mention of the city in which they have been found. So you should be suspicious right from the beginning. And it is said that in an old monastery, in a casket on which an inscription, very legible inscription surprisingly for its age, appear the words that these are Buddha's relics and so on. So you will see here that some wider strategy is being developed here. The Indian situation is different. That is, India has been rightly described as organized chaos. So it's one of the most beautiful descriptions of India. It's an organized chaos. And our students also, before they visit India, we tell them visit Italy, because of all European countries, Italy is the most disorganized country. That is very lovable, very human. People are nice to each other. They still have great regard for their mother, father. People, even over a small cup of coffee, 3 people will share, as in India. And they get along fine. They find joy in very small things. So people disobey rules and that kind of thing, which I have seen with my own eyes in Italy. So
we tell our students, first visit Italy, once you get used to it, you can go to India. So, something similar is it has to happen for China to spread out. China is also using the language of soft power. This is another thing. When their proponents speak in English, they do use the word soft power. So the arena of conflict with another ancient civilization like India has switched, and instead of a geographical area, it has become an area of ideology in which China has to negotiate the differing aspirations of its people. They cannot afford an internal rebellion. They do not want things to come to a boil and affect the gains they have made. Yes, in material terms, they have made very significant gains. Now, in this, the point is that India has been a very distinct civilization, has been continuous, and it's very ancient. Now, in the case of how old this is, the word Indology should be introduced. And in textbooks, you will see that a community with very different ideology entered Punjab or Haryana or what is called Afghanistan nowadays, or northwest part. That ideology around 1200 BC or 1500 BC, then they became dominant, then ideology spread to the south and to the east, and gradually Sanskrit language, Hinduism, other religions which are kins of Hinduism were born, and the country became what we have now. That is the narrative that our textbooks feed us. That is the narrative that is dominantly spread in countries outside India also. Newspapers in India and abroad are not even aware of alternative explanations. Educated Hindus, especially those who have done well in material life, have gone to affluent countries and so on, are naturally disturbed by this. Some of them, especially bright students on the science side, computer science side, they begin to question themselves, and they are raising questions that the regular Indian educational system is not raising, that the other lovers of India are not raising themselves. But there is a small but influential class of educated Indians which is raising these questions. And then you have issues such as California textbooks, which is until last week, which was a significant issue, where for the first time this small group of Indians has succeeded significantly, not 100% but significantly, and is at least forcing the writers of school textbooks to say that there was a view of history that I summarized earlier, but now alternative theories are also being mentioned. So this is sort of putting your foot in the door and hoping that the door will be opened more and more widely as time goes by. It has been an uphill struggle. So ideas such as ancientness, ideas such as what is contained in a native culture, what India claims as its original and lasting culture, as the very basis, with the bedrock of its other later developments, that has significant political consequences, that has significant economic consequences. And Indians are becoming aware of that. Maybe not to the same extent. Now, what does Indology do in this case? Here you will see the politics of Indology generally can be described as what is taught in the West and what is taught in India, but that's a very misleading description. Indians at present are basically westernized people in educational system. That is, the common tendency among Indian intellectuals, call them left or right, doesn't make much of a difference, is to disbelieve what the Indian historians of a new breed are talking about. That is, it is said, generally the suspicion, the apprehension has this form that you people are nationalists of an old sort, your nationalism is based on whatever has been said in the Smritis, Puranas, your ancient texts, and therefore you are making a case for a particular type of ancient India. It's not borne out by historical evidence, and if it is borne out, then it's because you are misinterpreting the text or suppressing the other side. You are not really scientific historians, and that kind of counter argument is made. Now, if you just go by probability, see that history is never 100% certain. Historical truth, in most cases, is unsteady. There is no such thing as something is proved beyond doubt. The reason is obvious, that not all evidence is preserved. And as you go back in time, less and less evidence is preserved. So you have more questions as you go back in time. That is very commonsensical. And therefore, the unsteadiness of history is to be made up by at least saying this is probable. And when in the history is discussed in newspapers, which is not a very healthy development if the newspaper editors themselves are not educated in a particular way, the reaction is that everything is stated in an unqualified way. That is, for the debate I briefly mentioned, there was no such thing as Aryans. If the other side is, we are not talking of Aryans as racists, we are talking about Aryans as speakers of a particular language or a particular complex of languages. And then the second thing is, how do you explain this minor development, that minor development? And the unqualified assertions are usually treated as, and rightly treated as, problematic. But one side, for historical reasons, is making unqualified claims. The other side is constantly doubting what they are saying and going to another extreme. What should be done in such a situation? If the debate is to proceed, some kind of probable truth is to emerge, is to talk in terms of probability. And that is politically very difficult to do because of the institution of newspapers that we have developed over the last 300 years or so. The qualified talk has suffered a setback. This is thought, we are short of space. We have people who are restless with something that is riddled with qualifications. They want plain truths bluntly stated, and therefore those who try to say in a qualified way find it very difficult to reach ordinary people. And in that situation, the history writing doesn't become very convincing, very popular, and that's what happens. Indology, if it is to be professionally developed, will have to speak in probable terms. So, given our present knowledge, what is probable? Now, here, hard sciences that do not depend on individual preferences, that do not have much scope for just expressing probably this happened, which are themselves certain, although their implications may be uncertain to some extent, those need to be given preferences. So astronomy, archaeology are much better sciences than linguistics. All three are useful, but genetics also one could include in all this. So some of these are still developing, especially historical genetic studies are slowly becoming greater and greater, requiring greater and greater precision. But astronomy, archaeology have taken considerable strides. They may differ in terms of hundreds of years, but still they are better than just a personal guess advanced by some historian. In the case of writing of history of early India, all earlier writings are predominantly just personal preferences. And sometimes a person like me wonders, because the Germans and the British who spoke of this ancient India came from a particular direction and they met the Middle Eastern civilizations first, and then the Islamic world, and then the Indian world. They are much more comfortable in talking, much more certain in talking of these early other civilizations which they have met on their way. And they are anything complex, diverse like India is suspected right from the beginning. There is, on the one hand, there is a temptation to make pronouncements, but on the other hand, there is a temptation not to give up what has been deduced in the case of the Middle Eastern world, the Christian world, and so on. It's near. Sometimes written evidence is found, and there is an understandable human tendency to say that's true, and everything in India has to be adjusted to that. Now, these two thoughts, that certain sciences we should rely on more, and the possibility that the historical world created for us is dominant for wrong reasons, is prevailing for wrong reasons. Given these two things, what can we say in Indological terms? First of all, archaeologists have said there is no evidence of a massive migration into India after 7000 BC. If any immigration happened, it happened before 7000 BC. The hymns of the Rig Veda that mentioned the Saraswati river as flowing, they said Saraswati, we know from geology, from satellite photography and other things, that Saraswati must have dried up sometime before 1900 BC. All these dates are being given as not later than. And that's the right scholarly spirit. If you cannot say with certainty, you give the lowest possible certainty. Good historians should not go for antiquity just because antiquity excites people more. So, on the one hand, you have 7000 BC indication. On the other indication is those parts of the Rig Veda which describe the Saraswati river as flowing could not be later than 1900 BC. This is a reasonable way. Third thing is astronomy, and in astronomy we have several comets mentioned, several constellations mentioned, right from earliest Vedic literature to Mahabharata. We can doubt individually cases, we can see a little bit wrong here or a little bit hasty inference in another case. We can do that. But it is quite clear that some of the Vedic texts speak of an astronomical situation in 3000 BC or 3100 BC. That's referring to stars that say see on the horizon. The Mahabharata war might not have taken place, it might have been a poetic creation, but the authors of that poetic description obviously knew certain events of great historical importance that took place in 3000 BC or 3100 BC. Again, referring to the comets and other things. So, if we have from hard sciences these indications which are taking the lowest level of them, the latest possibility for them, which we are expressing in probability terms in a cautious way, it still turns out that typical Indian civilization that is reflected in the Mahabharata could not be later than 3000 BC. Okay? And that is a commonsensical, Indological guess to make. The present politicized academia, which has affected Indology too, will constantly keep on saying, no, we still like the older dates. And if you say, why? Have you considered these, the kind of arguments that I summarized for you just now? There is, in the case of some historians, a definite tendency to suppress the new writings. So I don't mean suppress in the sense that they make it impossible for results to be published, but they ignore, simply ignore. Or if they're forced by interlocutors to show awareness of these new writings, they will simply say, oh, they are not professional historians. They don't know what they're talking about. And especially in genetics and archaeology, this kind of posture is taken, that we know what is sure. And then they will come up with something, when are the bones of the horse found, when are the horse riding, when was the chariot wheel discovered, and such things. Now, even if you create an atmosphere of uncertainty in such pieces, as a historian, it's your responsibility to account for the other pieces of evidence too. And that is not done. So obviously, the professional academic whose views are valued by ordinary, less educated people simply because they are appointed at universities, and in some cases appointed at universities that are generally considered to be prestigious, they are taking undue advantage of their position. This is, in some cases, why they are doing it is really mystery. But if you just go by psychology, it's like people do not like to be proven wrong. People do not like to lose their face in public. So, we have in Indology is actually a significant development that has occurred under normal circumstances and normal expectations made of academics, especially of historians. At least it should be admitted that a new alternative is emerging, which will make Indian civilization at least as old as the Middle Eastern civilizations, Akkadian and Sumerian and other things. But there is a resistance, it will change. I don't object to resistance itself, it's natural not to accept a new view right away. And academics are paid for being cautious, suspicious. To that extent, it's all right. But how long are you going to forget that there is a convergence of independent sources of science that points to an antiquity not later than 3000 BC? These are all independent indications, and that they all agree in a certain lower limit is very important, and it's unprofessional to deny the strength of such pieces of evidence. Okay, so this is where Indology becomes important. Now suppose we ignored this and we said, let the present teaching of history and Indology as it is continue, suppose. The consequences for a country like India are frightening. It doesn't look like that, but you see that the tendency to colonize will continue. The tendency to create inferiority complex among Indians will continue. And several other consequences that are essentially economic in nature, political in nature, but which spell a disastrous change for a civilization will occur. Now, again, someone can say, after all, what will happen? Indian nationalism will suffer. Indian self-pride will suffer. Why should we bother about it? Anyway, nationalism, self-pride are essentially blind things, and some blind tendencies will be discouraged. What's lost? Here we have a civilization that's going to lose, which has at a very early time said, all the world is one family. It has at a very early stage said, man is not master of nature. Man is supposed to live with nature and use nature in such a way that the natural order, the cosmic order does not suffer. Here is a culture that has taught that man is at a higher step in evolution. That's true. But not a higher step in order to control the natural world, but in order to put it to the best possible use. It says that an animal and a human being are not essentially different. And human beings have the ethical responsibility to protect animals. And you see this sort of teaching right from earlier text to a very late text in the Mimamsa system and so on. So, if such a culture is made to suffer a setback, is said to be an old, some kind of culture that has no scientific basis, that has no real claim, that's simply a matter of superstition among its citizens and so on. If you reduce it to that level, then what is left for other countries to be guided on the proper path? Will they continue to dig mines without any consideration of consequences? Will they continue to explode bombs without consideration of what's happening to other group of people? Will they have an iota of sympathy for other human beings that are not born with the same language, same skin color or something like that? Where will humanism rest? Where will humanism stand? And not for the sake of national boundaries, not for the sake of some transitory pride, this is to be done. It's because whatever happened in the past, India has this role to show that these other matters which create family feeling, which create a very attitude of loving for nature, that kind of civilization has to be preserved. Otherwise, everywhere there will be declining. And that is really the largest political context of a discipline like Indology. Indology will occasionally go wrong. Indology will not have all the proper means to gather evidence. Indologists will make mistakes. But if we ignore their findings, the price will not be only India's to pay. The price will be the world to pay.